Some of the healing from patterns of people pleasing and perfectionism is really getting to know your highest self. And how we do that is we create space. We get to know our parts and we name our parts. And as we do that, we can start to settle in to our highest innermost self. Hi, I'm Jen Barnes, and you're about to experience how to ditch the old ways of doing things, embrace your neurodivergence, learn tips and tricks to function optimally, and love yourself, neurodivergence and all. Welcome to the Self-Loved Woman podcast. I'm so excited to be here, and I'm glad you're joining me. Today, we're going to talk about two patterns of women with ADHD that tend to get in the way of us being effective and productive in the work we do. In fact, they even get in the way of us being able to start and finish things. So if you're having a hard time with these things, then this episode is for you. So let's dig right in. There are two patterns that I see a lot in ADHD women. I've seen them at different times in my own life as well, that I really see as significant barriers to being able to do what we want to do for and inside of our businesses. So the first one that we'll talk about is perfection. And you might be thinking, I'm not a perfectionist, and that might be true. Maybe you're not a perfectionist. What I find is a lot of us ADHDers who weren't diagnosed as kids, or even if we were, but learned to mask our ADHD in order to, limit criticism and not be in trouble. A lot of us tend to have perfectionistic tendencies, right? You might not consider yourself a perfectionist, but I wonder if there's some times when maybe it's like, oh, I've got to get this right, or, oh, I don't want anyone to see that, or some of those kind of messages. And that's what I'm talking about. Because the problem is when we do that perfectionistic thinking, when we're like, oh, this has to be like, the best ever, or can't have any mistakes, or, we try and hide our messiness is another thing, then we are actually making it harder for us to get ourselves to do things. It can be harder to start things when we are thinking like, oh, it has to be perfect, right? It can be hard to just even get ourselves to start, but it can also be hard to finish. Yeah, sure. Some of what gets in the way of us being able to finish things is, novelty. Like when the novelty wears off, it's like, oh, I really don't want to do that anymore. So that can be a piece of it. But some of it is perfectionism, right? Because once we say it's done, then it's open for public consumption. It's open for potential judgment and criticism, where if we're still working on it, then there can be no criticism. What I see at the root of our perfectionism is this desire to avoid criticism, to avoid judgment. And that's fair. Like, we come by this so honestly with ADHD because anytime our ADHD showed up, we were incredibly often we were criticized, right? I know I've shared that estimation about how many more times a child with ADHD is criticized by the time they're 10. And it's like 20,000 more times, which is like they came by that with like a very conservative number, like 3 times an hour by teachers. You are given a constructive, maybe not always constructive, but you're given a critical comment or some kind of instruction to fix what you've done, more than kids who don't have ADHD. And so think about that. Eventually the message is like, I've got to be perfect, because we get criticized so much more, right? And in attempt to avoid it, we work our butts off, or try to, so that things come out perfect, and then we aren't criticized or put down or even harshly judged or called names for our ADHD, like lazy or stupid, or told that we don't care, those kind of messages. So if this is you, like I said, you come by this honestly. But the problem is perfectionism is getting in the way of so many parts of your life. Like I said already, it's getting in the way of you starting projects, because it's like, oh, I'm not ready to make sure this is perfect. I need everything. I need all the stuff before I even start. It's got to be perfect and awesome, instead of just doing it, right? Instead of just getting started. We can't even start because we're waiting for it to be perfect. And here's the thing, probably it's never going to be perfect because you're human. I'm sure you're brilliant and awesome and amazing, but as a human, very little that we do is ever going to be 100% perfect. I used to be in this one program, and the leader of the program, his name is Brandon Lucero, would say 70% perfect is perfect, 100% perfect is failure. And it's like, huh? Why? Because if you're going for 100% perfect, are you ever going to finish it? No. And in fact, if you think you have to have it 100% perfect, I would argue with ADHD, you're probably not even going to start. But then, like the saying, like I just said, you also may struggle to finish. Not only does the novelty wear off, but now it's heavy because it's like, oh gosh, if I finish, that means like it's a done deal. And that's just not a productive way to think of things, right? Carol Dweck, you've heard me talk about her before. She wrote the book Mindset. She talks about the fixed mindset versus the growth mindset, with the fixed mindset being one where like mistakes mean that you don't have it, that like you're not good enough, right? Whereas the growth mindset sees mistakes as learning opportunities. And yes, that's important for the regular general population, neurotypical population, but I think it's even more important for those of us with ADHD because we are living in this neurotypical world. So we are going to do things that look like mistakes more often or that look like mess ups because we're trying to navigate something that isn't created the way our brain works. So I don't think of mistakes as mistakes. I think of them as learning opportunities like, oh, that didn't work or that was ineffective. And sometimes it was ineffective because it was just ineffective, regardless if we're ADHD or not. And sometimes it's ineffective because we're ADHD living in a neurotypical world, right? We can really start to think about like, okay, how do I shift my focus towards that growth mindset? How do I start to see mistakes as learning opportunities? Because when you do that, you actually become more efficient and more productive. You actually make less mistakes. First of all, you don't see them as mistakes. You're like, oh, okay. Well, the way that I first started doing that is when I would make a mistake, I'd be like, oh, whoops a daisies. That's not how I wanted to do that. Like I would literally say whoops a daisies because it was funny. Right. Because then it kind of lightened the mood, like versus like, oh, you dumbass. Because that doesn't lighten the mood. Right. I'd be like, oh, whoops a daisies. That's not quite what I wanted to do there. That wasn't my first choice of how I'd handle that. Yeah. So some of it is starting to shift that narrative. And you may have some parts that hold deeper seated trauma around this. And as I always say, seek out a therapist who can help you with that trauma. I'm particularly partial. I don't know if that makes sense, particularly partial to IFS therapists, first of all, because I am one, but secondly, because they can work with these parts of us, right? That hold these beliefs that tend to limit us, that are often rooted in genuinely traumatic experiences. So if you can start to work with this part yourself and be like, oh yeah, I see you wanting to call me a dumbass for this, but whoops daisies, that's not what I wanted to do. And it's not that you don't care. It's just that you're not going to berate yourself every time you do something that is less than perfect. Yeah. Some of this is going to be getting comfortable with other people's being disappointed. And we'll talk with the second pattern, the close cousin of perfectionism, which is people pleasing, surprise. But we'll talk more about what that can look like as well. But a lot of times, letting go of perfectionism is going to be letting go of our own judgment, but then getting comfortable with like, other people are going to have their opinion. They're going to think what they think. I can't control that. It's generally not my business what they think. And some days that's easy and some days that's hard. And some days it's in the middle, like it'll sting and then we'll kind of work through it and be like, I just can't focus my energy on that. If so-and-so thinks I'm an idiot, that's what they think, right? Or if they don't like working with me because sometimes I'm messy, well, you know what? Like I have ADHD. Sometimes emails are going to get sent out without an attachment. Sometimes I'm going to send an email to half my list and forget the other half. And so some people will get it twice and then you'll get an apology email from me. Like that's just kind of how I roll. And I find that you might be thinking like, gosh, that's super irresponsible. And maybe it is, I don't know. Or maybe what it does is it's good modeling. That let's stop being perfectionistic over stupid stuff that doesn't matter. Like, yeah, okay, a second email inconveniences people. And in those situations, I'm truly sorry. And at the same time, the amount of effort, energy, and masking that has to happen for an ADHD person to never, ever do that makes us lose our entire life. I could probably make it so that I don't ever send out a mistake email, but I would be spending all of my time and energy on working. I wouldn't have any free time. I wouldn't have any rest time. I wouldn't have any relaxation. I would feel crazy and eventually I'd burn out. In fact, I know I would have been there, done that. Right? So, what if instead we start to create this world where mistakes aren't bad? And some mistakes, it's just like, yeah, I got the point, whatever. Right? It kind of reminds me of I had a friend who would correct me if I said something that was slightly inaccurate, but they knew what I meant. And I was like, did you know what I meant? And they're like, yeah. And I'm like, why do you have to correct me? Like, you got the point of what I was saying. Like, why did you have to correct me? And they were like, well, because it was inaccurate. And I'm like, and who cares? It's just you and me. Right. And to me, that's the kind of world I want to live in. One where we can just kind of give people the benefit of the doubt. I'm a therapist, and in sessions sometimes people are like, "Oh, I mean, this is what I meant." And I'm like, "No, I got it. You don't have to correct yourself or be worried that I'm going to judge you. Like, I got from the context of what you were saying, I got it. It's okay. You don't have to apologize for not accurately speaking, because when we live in that kind of world where we have to say everything with 100% accuracy and never make mistakes because we see mistakes as a sign that we're not good enough. I don't know about you, but that stresses me out and it makes life a hell of a lot less fun. And I got to tell you, at 49, I am no longer interested in trying to live that way. First of all, it doesn't work because you're still going to make mistakes anyway. And second of all, like, let's all just give each other a break. Life is hard. Life is really hard. We were never meant to work full time and be in charge of households completely. Like, that was never the deal when they designed the 40-hour work week if you live in the States. The deal was is you would have one person taking care of the house and the kids and the other person was working full time, and that one income would be enough to support you. That was also when it was believed that people had to be married, which, now I'm like, I'm single. I don't want to be married. Technically, I'm divorced, but I was divorced 22 years ago. So at what point do I get to start to say I'm single again, right? But it's true. It's like this the way that we live now was never what was intended, that we had all this stuff. And so, what if we can just let some things be good enough? So, what if we can just let go of needing things to be perfect? And that means that sometimes our ADHD messiness and chaos is going to show up. And what if we don't even apologize for it unless it truly inconveniences someone? You know, what if it's just like, oh, sometimes my brain does that. Thanks for your patience. I think it's a really important shift for us ADHDers to make, because as we let go of that perfectionism, as we let ourselves be messy, we actually end up eventually being less messy because we have spaces where we can be messy and relax. Because when we're less stressed and relaxed, we're actually better focused. And then we're going to make less mistakes to begin with. Not that mistakes are bad, but if we're wanting to impact people less by our ADHD messiness, the way to do it is actually to let ourselves be messy, which sounds crazy, but it's totally true. All right. So that's some on perfectionism. What I will say, one more thing. I think what is beneath this on a deep level is that we don't believe we can handle the judgment and criticism from others. And I want to talk about that more after we talk about people pleasing, because there's a reason we don't trust that we can handle it, right? A part of us doesn't trust that another part of us can't handle it. And we'll unpack that more after this next section. So stay tuned. The second pattern that you've heard me mention that I see really getting in the way of ADHD women being able to be efficient and productive and do the stuff we need to do for our businesses and for our lives is people pleasing. And again, we come by this so honestly. We learn to people please so that, like, we would be judged less and criticized less. One of the ways this shows up, and I noticed this in my own life, is like I would work my butt off and always be the yes person and always go over and above, so that, I mean, this was all subconscious. This wasn't like me, harboring, not harboring, but like, I can't think of the word I want, but you know what I mean? Like planning my evil plan. Like, it was all subconscious. But if I did all that, if I did everything almost perfectly, if I took on extra projects, if I was the yes person, then when I mess some shit up, because my ADHD messiness would eventually kind of burst out everywhere because I could only hold it in for so long, people would give me more grace. Because it's like, oh, it's Jen. She's amazing. We'll just let it go, you know? I don't know about you, but that was one way I masked my ADHD. Like I said, I wasn't like doing it in a manipulating way or even with like cognitive intention, conscious intention. It was just more subconsciously something I figured out at a young age that if I work really hard and do go over and above and help people, then I get more leeway. My little child self figured that out, right? In a lot of ways, it's brilliant. It was a way to, and if you did this, it was a way that we avoided getting slammed for a mistake that other people would maybe be, slightly judged for. So if you do this pattern of people pleasing, you come by it honestly. And what does this look like in adulthood? This looks like saying yes to everything. When someone asks you to do something, it means saying yes, even when inside you want to say no. It means holding someone accountable with compassion, even if that's hard to do because they might be mad at us. Or, sorry, not doing that is what the people pleasing means, right? Like not holding people accountable and just sucking it up and be like, well, okay, I guess. I mean, that sucked, but okay, right? And not speaking up is what it looks like when we're masking with people pleasing. It looks like taking on extra projects. It looks like telling people what they want to hear. It looks like going over and above and always volunteering for extra things. But the problem is when you do this, you feel burned out. And then you feel like you care more about people than they care about you because you're putting in all this time and energy and no one else seems to see it. Or maybe they see it a little bit, but the reward isn't there, right? It's exhausting. People pleasing is exhausting. And a lot of times it's very lonely because when we're people pleasing, we're not being our authentic self, very similar with perfectionism. And when we're not being our authentic self, there's not a lot for people to plug into to really get to know us because they're not actually seeing us. They're seeing the parts of us that are helping us mask our ADHD. So then we feel unseen and unheard and like no one understands us or cares about us. And maybe they don't because we're not letting them. So not only is people pleasing and perfectionism, not only are they exhausting, but they also can be very isolating and make us feel very alone and uncared for. A lot of times what's beneath people pleasing is this fear that we're not good enough or that we'll let someone down or they'll be disappointed in us or that they'll be mad at us. And if they're mad at us, we can't handle that. Like we can't handle their anger. We can't handle their disappointment. We can't handle their criticism. And to be fair, a lot of us are probably maxed out on criticism from growing up, ADHD. And we believe we can't handle more. And sure, it's uncomfortable. Like no one likes to be criticized. No one likes to be judged. Like it's uncomfortable. But inside of ourselves, there's something that believes that we can't handle it. So in order to be able to move beyond people pleasing, we've got to find a way to get comfortable with other people's disappointment, or at least not take it on. We've got to be able to get comfortable with telling people no and having them maybe not like it. Because the thing is, the only people that are going to get really upset with us when we say no, the people that tend to get the most upset are the people who have been benefiting most from our yes that we wanted to be a no. Right? Those people are pissed because they've been taking advantage of the situation and on some level they know it. And they're like, I just want this again. I just want you to go back the way you were. And some people use anger to try and get us to go back to what we were doing for them. And generally that, I don't know, that isn't about me. If someone's angry that they've been taking advantage of a situation of me being too people pleasy, right? Because we can bounce back and forth into these things on occasion, even if we've healed some of that. And so, if I bop into being too people pleasing and then I pull back, I'm like, you know what? No, this isn't a fit for me. I'm not going to do that. And someone gets mad and we're acting in a way that's kind and compassionate and respectful and following through on what we say, but also not letting ourselves be a doormat and being taken advantage of. If someone's mad at us, that is just not our stuff. That is their stuff that they're not getting their way and they're handling it by anger. Sometimes they're even handling it by trying to bully us with their anger. And a lot of times it's worked in the past. A lot of us are like, okay, I'll do it because we don't want to be judged. We want people to like us. I mean, I don't know about you, but like with ADHD, sometimes like before I knew I had ADHD and before I felt confident inside of myself, I had a hard time with finding my people. There's a lot of people who generally don't like me. And I used to not be okay with that. And now I'm like, all right, well, I can't be involved in that. People are going to like me or they're not. It's just not my business. And the funny thing that happens is when we do that and we just lean into who we are, first of all, we feel better because we're aligning with who we are most authentically. So then we feel comfortable in our own skin. But the funny thing that happens is we attract the people who do like us. And then the ones who don't kind of fade away into the background. And it's nothing against them. It's just maybe we're not a fit to be in close relationship. Right. So I want to talk about what's beneath both of these tendencies, the patterns of perfectionism and the patterns of people pleasing, because they're different. First of all, they have a lot in common in terms of like trying to protect ourselves, right? Like those are tools that we've learned or ways that parts of us have learned to protect ourselves from criticism, judgment, people yelling at us, people being disappointed in us, maybe even internal parts of us criticizing us and being disappointed in us, right? Perfectionism and people pleasing have that in common. But what I think is beneath all of this is a deep seated belief that we can't handle it if those things happen. And that, my friends, when we believe that we can't handle it, those are parts of us believing that other parts of us can't handle it. Because your highest self, your deep soul self, your truest self, the part of you, your consciousness, the part of you that always lives, the part of you that's ever present and never dies, the part of you that's compassionate, which isn't really a part, it's the core of you, but the core of you who's compassionate and curious and clear and connected and creative and confident. I always forget some of the 8 C's, so bear with me. But that being inside of you isn't a part at all. That is who you are at your core. And you know how to handle all this. It's just that you have parts of you that don't see who you are. They don't see your light, probably don't even know that you're a grown up. So they don't think that you can handle other people's judgment, criticism, disappointment, and anger, and probably don't believe that you can handle that from inside yourself. So, some of the healing from these patterns of people pleasing and perfectionism is really getting to know your highest self. And how we do that is we create space. We get to know our parts and we name our parts. And as we do that, we can start to settle in to our highest innermost self. You might be thinking, how in the world do I do that? And yeah, it's deep stuff. It's deep stuff. And if you've never done it, I mean, there's, certainly books I can recommend. Self-therapy is a great one. Dick Schwartz has written a bunch of books on IFS and that were not written only for clinicians, that were written for people who don't provide IFS, but who want to use the model. Some of it is really being able to notice that highest self. And I will tell you the way that I connect in with that, the way I initially connected in with that was through mindfulness practices. And if you've got ADHD, you're like, oh, she's going to talk about mindfulness again. Bear with me, stay with me. I get why mindfulness is hard. Mindfulness is hard for a lot of us. Some of it is that it's hard because we carry trauma, right? We carry trauma from growing up ADHD in a neurotypical world, but some of us carry complex trauma. And so the thought of sitting there with your thoughts and just letting them be can feel incredibly overwhelming. So there are ways to practice meditation or mindfulness meditation that are trauma sensitive. And those are things that I share in my program, but I'm sure you could look up ways to do that as well. But one of the things that's important there is the power of choice. Another thing that's important is staying within your window of tolerance. So if you're practicing mindfulness and you catch yourself being hyper aroused, like you're in your fight or flight response, you feel anxious or angry or irritable, or you feel hypo aroused, you feel dissociative or checked out or numb. If you're outside of that window of tolerance of feeling ventral vagal, we've talked about that before, but that place where you're safe enough to rest, digest, and connect. If you're outside of that window, then it's time to pause. It's time to put the brakes on your mindfulness. And one way to do that in that session is to open your eyes, to feel your feet on the floor. You could do 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, which is a skill that I'm sure I've talked about in a podcast, but you basically use your 5 senses to notice stuff, right? And you start, the 5 is the sense that's the easiest to notice stuff with, which is your vision, your eyes. So you notice 5 things you see. Then the next easiest is touch. So you notice 4 things that you feel. Then 3 things that you hear, 2 things that you smell, and 1 thing that you taste. And the numbers don't matter, but just to start to notice things in your environment to get present. So that's a tip for if you feel overwhelmed by thoughts in mindfulness or in meditation or mindfulness meditation, because there's lots of kinds of meditation, lots of kinds of mindfulness. But that's one option. If you do start to feel overwhelmed, or if you're concerned about feeling overwhelmed, is you can always come out of it. I would also recommend only starting with like 1 minute long sessions. Another thing you can do is do movement-based meditation. I started out, the first way I did actually, certainly you could call it meditation, but I meant mindfulness. I started out doing mindfulness by running, right? I was a runner. And I would notice before I even knew I was doing it, I would notice my breath and my feet hitting along with my breath, right? Hitting the pavement or my shoes hitting the pavement, whatever, but I would feel my feet, right? That's mindfulness. I then would teach it with indoor cycling. Once I'd had some experience teaching mindfulness, I was an indoor cycling instructor, and I would teach how you feel your ball of your foot on the metal part of your on the metal part of the pedal. And then you feel your hamstring engage as you pull your heel up on the back side of the pedal stroke. And then as you come around, you feel your quadricep engage as you push down through the ball of your foot through the metal part of the pedal to move through the front side of the pedal stroke. And have people notice that. And then you notice your breath. Maybe you notice the gentle sway that happens when you're cycling. Now, if you're an outdoor cyclist, I'd be careful using this because you want to make sure that you're still paying attention to where you're going. Keep your eyes open. But so much of how we move our bodies can be mindfulness. You can do mindfulness with toothbrushing. You can do mindfulness with washing the dishes. So this podcast episode isn't on mindfulness, but as we're talking about getting to know your highest self, your self energy, some of it is being able to be mindfully aware, because the one who's aware, that's your highest self. The one who is watching, the witness self, the one who's aware, is your self energy. And there's more to self energy than just the one who's aware, but that's a piece of it. So I find as we practice these mindfulness practices, whatever you choose, you will start to get to know your highest self better, and your parts will start to get to know you too. So that then there can be some trust that, you know what? Yeah, that person might think I'm a dumbass because I sent that email and it was not perfect. And yeah, maybe I could improve on my emails. I'm not saying we don't take accountability or responsibility or consider where we can continue to grow, but also we can maybe be a little more gentle with ourselves around where we want to put our growing energy, and stepping away from being on one fix-it project after another to just living in alignment in a full and loving way. All right, y'all, that's what I have for today. I'm so glad you decided to join me for the whole podcast. Make sure you follow if you're not following yet, and I would love it if you would share. Take care.